The same mortal hunt is proceeding today through our streets. Can you see him? The angel of the plague, as fair as Lucifer, the shining like evil itself, rising up above the rooftops. His right hand bearing the red spear level with his head, and his left hand pointing the one at one of your houses. At this very moment, perhaps, his finger is stretching towards your door, and the spear is sounding in the wood. A moment later, the plague is entering your home, sitting down in your room, awaiting your return. It is there, patient and watchful, as sure as the very older of the world. No earthly power, not even note this well. Vain human science can shield you from this hand as it reaches out for you. Beaten on the bloody threshing floor of the pain, you will cast out with the chaff. Then the priest expanded even more on the pregnant image of the veil. He suggested that the image of the mighty piece of wood turning above the town, striking indiscriminately and returning covered in blood, only to scatter the bloody and human misery in the snowing that would make way for the harvest of truth. At the end of the long development, Father Panelu stopped. His hair on the forehead of his body was shaken by a tremor, and his hands communicated to the pulpit. Then he resumed in a duller but more accusing tone. Yes, the hour has come to reflect. You thought that it was enough for you to go visit God on Sunday, to be free to do as you wish for the rest of the week. You thought that a few general reflection wished for you the rest of the week. You thought that you would be sufficient for a compensation for a criminal lack of concern. But God is not lukewarm. Such a casual relationship is not sufficient for his all-devouring affection. He wanted to see you longer. This is his way of loving, and in truth, it is the only way. This is why, tired of waiting for you to come to him, he is allowed to scourge your visit as you have visited all the cities of sin since history began. You know now what sin is, and Cain and his son knew. Those before the flood, those of Sodom and Gomorrah, Pharaoh and Job were all accused. And as they all did, now you have been looking with fresh eyes on people and on things since the day when the town closed and the walls around you and around the scourge. You know at last that you must arrive at the heart of the matter. A moist wind was now blowing along the nave of the candle flames, glittered and bent. The thick smell of wax, coughing and yawning rose up towards Father Panelu, who, resuming his analysis with much appreciative subtlety, went on calmly. For many of you, I know, are starting to wonder what I'm leading to. I want to bring you to the truth and teach you to rejoice despite all that I have said. This is no longer the time for advice. It is not the time for the fraternal hand provide the means to steer you towards the goodness. Today the truth is in order, and it is a red spear that points you down the way of salvation and drives you towards it. My brethren, this is where finally divine mercy is revealed in the mercy that have been put into everything good and well as evil, anger and pity, plague and starvation. This very scourge and assail you rise up by and show you the way. A long time ago, the Christians of Albania saw the plague an effective means to win entirely the means sent by God. Those who were not infected would roll themselves in the bedcloth of the victims so as to ensure their own deaths. Of course, one would not recommend such zeal in search of salvation. The exhibit a regrettable haste, which is close to pride. One must not be greater hurry than God in everything that aims to spread the inevitable order of things, which he has established once and all for all, leads and hearsay. But at least this example carries a lesson. To more far-sighted minds, immediately enhances the exquisite glimmer of entirety that shines the depths of all suffering. This is the light that illuminates the dim path, which leads to deliverance. It manifests the divine will, which unfruitably transforms evil into good. Today, through the paths of death, anguish, and sighs, it still guides us towards the silence of God and the principles of all life. This, my brethren, is immersed in the consolation, and I wish to bring you, so that what you will take away from here should not be only the language of testament, but also the word of being that brings peace. One could feel that Penelue had finished. Outside, the rain had ceased. The sky, in which water mingled with sunshine, and casted a fresher light across the square. Sounds of voices that were gladdening of cars rose from the streets, the language of the town as it wakes. Members of the congregation gathered their things and muscle jumbled of the sound. Yet the priest was speaking again. He said that after showing the divine origin of the plague, the primitive nature of scourge, he had finished with that and would not resort to the conclusion of the eloquence that would have misplaced given the tragic characters of the subject. He thought that everything must be cleared to them. He reminded them only that on the occasion of the great plague of Marseille, the historian Matthew Martis had complained of being plagued into hell, of living without help and without hope. Well, Matthew Maris was blind. Never before had Father Penelue felt more intensely the aid of God and the Christian hope that was held out to them all. He hoped against all hope that despite the horror of these days, the cries of dying, our fellow citizens would offer heaven, and only would the Christian should, which was the word of love, God who would do the rest. Whether the sermon had any effect on the townspeople, it was hard to say. Amothone had examining magistrate announced to Dr. Ryu that he found Father Penelue's analysis absolutely irrefutable, but not everyone had such categorical opinions. Quite simply, the sermon made some people more respective of the notion, which had emerged vague up till then, and they were condemned to some unknown crime to an unimaginable term of imprisonment. And while some carried on with their little lives, adaptive of being shut in, the others, on the contrary, their sole idea from then on was to escape from this prison. At first, people had agreed to being cut off from the outside, as they might have accepted the temporary irritation that would only interfere for a few of their habits. But suddenly becoming conscious of a kind of incarceration beneath the lid of the sky, in which summer was beginning to crackle, they felt the same vague that they confinement threatened their whole lives, and when evening came, the cool brought renewed energy and sometimes drove them to desperate actions. First of all, whether or not by coincidence, it was from that Sunday onwards that the sort of fear arose in the general enough and deep enough for one to subject that people of the town really were starting to become aware of their situation. From that point of view, the climate in which we lived here was somewhat altered. But was the change really in the climate or the people's hearts and minds? That was the question. A few days after the sermon, Ryu, discussing the events with Gran as they were walking towards the suburbs, ran into a man who was swaying around in front of them without making an effort to go forwards. At that very moment, the street lamps, which were lighting up later and later in the town, suddenly came on. The high lamp right behind the two men suddenly lit up, and the stranger, who was laughing noisily with his eyes shut, down his pale face, contoured with the silent myth, sweat, and pouring the large drops, and walked past them. "A madman," said Grand. Rayu, who had just taken his arm to lead him forward, felt that the clerk was trembling with annoyance. "Soon there will only be mad people in the town," Rayu said, partly because he was tired and his throat felt dry. "Let's have a drink." In a thick reddish atmosphere of the little cafe they entered, lit a single lamp above the counter. People were talking in low voices, for no obvious reason. To Rayu's surprise, when they got to the counter, Grand ordered a glass of brandy, which he drank in a single gulp, saying that it was strong, and then wanted to leave. Outside, it seemed to Rayu the night was full of sighting and mourning. Somewhere in the black sky above the street lamps was a dull whistle, reminded him of the visible scourge of endlessly staring at the warm air. Luckily, Grand said. Rayu wondered what he meant. Luckily, the other man said, "I have my work." "Yes," said Rayu, "it does help." And then, deciding not to listen to the whistling sound, he asked Grand if he was satisfied with his work. "Well, I think I'm on the right track." "Will it take you much longer?" Grand seemed to become excited, and the warmth of the alcohol passed into his voice. "I don't know, but that's not the question. Doctor, that's not the question, no." In the darkness, Rayu guessed that he was waving his arm and seemed to be getting ready to say something, then came abruptly in a rush. "You see, what I want, Doctor, is that on the day that the manuscript reaches the publisher, he should stand up after reading it and say to his colleagues, 'Hats off, gentlemen.'" Rayu was surprised by the sudden declaration. He felt that his companion was making a gesture of taking his hat off, bringing his hand up to his head and resting his arm in a horizontal position. And this, the particular whistling sound seemed to resume in a greater force. "Yes," Grand said, "it must be perfect." Though he knew very little about the customs and practices of literary words, Rayu had the impression that the things were not so simple. And, for example, the publisher, who would be bareheaded in his office, but in fact, one never knew if he preferred not making the remarks about it. Despite himself, he was listening to the mysterious noise of the plague. Two men were getting closer to Grand's neighborhood, and since it was the slight hill, they were cooled by the mid-breeze, which was the same time cleans the town of all noises. However, Grand went on talking, and Rayu could not always follow what the good fellow was saying. He only understood the work in question and already knew many pages long, and the efforts of the author was taking to bring the perfection cost him dear. Whole evenings, whole weeks on one word, sometimes just a simple conjugation. Here Grand stopped and took a hold of the doctor by the button of his coat, and the words stumbled out like an ill-adjusted mouth. "You understand, Doctor. At a pinch, it is easy enough to choose between but and and. It already becomes more difficult when you opt for and or then, and the difficulty grows with then or afterwards. And what is surely hardest is to decide whether one should put an and or not." "Yes," Rayu said, "I understand." He set off again. The other man seemed confused and once more caught up with him. "Excuse me," he stammered. "I don't know what's wrong with me this evening." Rayu tapped him lightly on the shoulder and said he wanted to help him because his story interested him a good deal. Grand seemed a little calmer when they arrived at the house, hesitated for a moment, and invited the doctor to come up. Rayu accepted. In the dining room, Grant invited him to sit down at the table spread with papers and manuscripts in Minut's handwriting and covered with crossing outs. Yes, that's it, Grant told the doctor, who was looking at him with inquiry. But would you like a drink? I have a little wine. Ryu refused, and he looked at the sheets of paper. Don't look, Grant said. It's my first sentence. It's giving me trouble, a lot of trouble. He too was starting at the pages, and his hands seemed so irresistibly drawn towards one of them, which he raised up until the light from the unshaven bulb was shining through it, and the sheet trembled in his hands. Ryu noticed the clerk's forehead was damp. Sit down, Ryu said, and read it to me. The other man looked at him with a kind of gratitude. Yes, he said, I think I'd like to. He waited for a moment, still looking at the sheet of paper, then he sat down. Ryu listened at the same time, a sort of vague humming sound in the town, as if to reply to the whistling wail of the plague. At the particular moment, he had extraordinary acute perception of the town spreading at his feet. Enclosed worlds were that it formed, and the dreadful cries stiffened in the night. He heard Grant's muffled voice. On a fine morning in the mouth of May, the elegant woman is riding a magnificent swirl mare through the flowers avenue of the Boris de Boulogne. Silence returned with it, a faint murmuring of the suffering town. Grant had put down the piece of paper, but was still staring at it. After a pause, he looked up. What do you think of it? Ryu replied that this beginning made him curious to know what would follow. But the other man said it was an experiment, that this was not the right way of looking at it. He slapped the flat of his hand down on the paper. That's only a rough idea. When I have to manage to describe precisely the picture I have in my imagination. But my senses have the same way movement of trotting horses. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The rest will easily, and above all, the illusion will be such form that the very start of it will possibly say, hats off, gentlemen. However, before he had reached his point, there was still a lot of work to be done. He would never agree to hand over the sentence as it was the printer, because from time to time he did feel pleasure with it. He realized that he was still not entirely accord to the reality of that. To some extent, it had a certain facility of tone. It made it sound distinctly, but sound for all that was like a cliché. At any rate, that was the sense that what he was saying when he heard some man running past below the windows where he got up. You'll see what I'll do with it, Grant said. Then I turned to the window he added, when all this is over. But the sound of running feet returned. Ryu was already going downstairs. The two gentlemen ran past him and reached the streets. They appeared to be going towards the town gates. In fact, some of our fellow citizens, driven out of their minds by the heat and the idea of plague, had resorted to violence and tried to evade the guards on the barriers in order to flee the town. Others, like Rambert, were also trying to escape from the atmosphere and the increasing panic. Through with more obvious skill, if not more success. First, Rambert had continued his work through the official channels. He had always said that he thought obscenity would eventually triumph over anything, and said in some way his job involved using his wits to get around problems. So he went to see a large number of civil servants and people who were complete sent with once did not usually question. But the circumstances this was complicit was useless to them. Most of the time, they were men who had prices and fixed notions about everything to do with the blanking extorts and citrus fruits, or perhaps the wine trade. They had undurable experience with problems of ligations and insurance, and not to mention excellent qualifications and evident goodwill. You might say that the most striking thing among all of them was their goodwill. But when it came to plague, their knowledge was more or less nil. However, Rambert had put his case to each of them wherever it was possible. The bias of his argument remained the same. He said that he was a foreigner to our town, and that consequently his case should be given special consideration. In general, those the journalists approached were willing to consider the point, but most of the time they argued that the number of people were in the situation his case will not be exceptional as he imagined. To this, Rambert might reply that he did not alter the substance of his argument at all, to which they answered that they did alter something in respect of the administration, that being unfavorable in any measure of exemption might tend to create what, with expression of great repugnance, they call it the predestined, according to the classification which Rambert suggested to Dr. Rayu, for those who argue in a way that belongs to the category of formalist. In addition to these, they were also the fine words who accused the client that none of this could last, and who, full of good advice when one wanted from the decision, consoled Rambert by telling him that all of this was only temporary inconvenience. There were also a high and mighty who requested the visit to leave a note summarizing his case and told him that they would give a ruling on it. The futile for offering hours of coupons and address for cheap boarding houses. The methical who got you to fill out a form and then filed it. The overworked who held their hands in the air and interrupted, who looked at the other direction. And finally there were the tradelist, by far the greatest number, who directed Rambert to another office and suggested some alternative course of action. So the journalist had exhausted himself with visits and gained a clear idea of the Hotel de Ville on the prefecture worked. After waiting on the imitation leather bench in front of the large poster inviting him to subscribe to the issue of tax-free bonds or to join the colonial army, and going into the office after another where he could as easily foresee the faces that would greet him in the filing cabinets and shelves of Dessor. The good thing about this, as Rambert told Rayu, with a hint of bitterness, was that it hid the real situation from him. He was practically unaware of the spread of plague, not to mention it made the days go faster in the situations as a whole the town found itself. You might say that every day went by brought each man, provided he did not die, closer to the end of his troubles. Rayu had to acknowledge that this was true, but the truth goes, it was rather a broad one.